Hello, IML students. Today we are going to learn about the history of Forex. It is important to know about the history of Forex because we need to understand how our money system has worked in the past in order to understand how it can change and how to use it to our advantage moving forward. Before we get started, here's a little bit about myself. My name is Adeze Duncan, representing iMarkets Live. Some of you may know me from Forex 101 on IML TV. Also, I was an educator for 10 years, and now I'm here educating you on the facts and methods of Forex. In order to get started on this journey, you need to remember one thing and one thing only. I am a student, always. This is very important for you to remember and to remind yourself of often. You will hear me use this phrase frequently as a reminder that you are a student that is learning a skill that will pay you for the rest of your life. Make sure that you take your time and learn what you need to learn. Pace yourself. Do not compare yourself to anyone else's progress. Always keep a winning mind frame and you will do very well in this industry. Upon finishing this video, you should have a very good understanding of the following questions. Read through them quietly to yourself. As you are taking notes, make sure to pause this video in order to answer these questions. Now let's get started on the history of Forex. Starting with the bartering system. In the bartering system, people exchanged goods for services. People typically traded things such as livestock, skills, talents, grains, and agriculture, and even people. With the bartering system, people traded things they didn't need for things they wanted or needed. For example, the hunter might trade 10 rabbits to the carpenter for the carpenter's promise to fix his roof. The bartering system may have been very easy to establish. However, it was very much rigged with issues. For instance, what if you had something that no one else wanted? It would be very hard to exchange. The limited shelf life also presented an issue. If you were trading livestock or agriculture, their condition depended on their age and condition. For example, you wouldn't get very much money with a bunch of dying fruits and vegetables. Trying to transport those types of goods and services would put a huge demand on the trader. They would have to travel with a large barrage of people in order to care for their property that they wanted to exchange. Many times, goods would spoil and animals would often die during transport. There was also the issue of fairness in exchange. Both people would have to agree about what each wanted before the exchange could be done. Another issue was trying to do business in small increments. Most things had to be traded in bulk. Eventually, the bartering system was abandoned for a more intermediate commodity system. In ancient China, Africa, and India, they used cowrie shells. Trade in Japan was based on the koku, which was a unit of rice. The shekel was a specific weight of barley. Contrary to popular belief, precious metals have rarely been used outside of large societies in the form of trade due to them being very scarce and hard to mine. Gold in particular has only been used as currency for a few relatively brief periods in history. Money in the shape of small knives and arrows made out of bronze were used in China during the Zhou dynasty. This form of money was quickly abandoned over time for something less prickly shaped and in the form of a circle, which later became some of the first coins. The first minted coins were created in Lydia in 700 BC, which is now modern-day Turkey. And by minted, I mean coins that were already pre-weighed and marked to show how much they weighed. These coins were made from electrum, which was a mixture of silver and gold that occurs naturally. These coins had a lot of advantages. Now people could actually trade what they wanted for what they needed and exchange coinage rather than goods and services that had to be agreed upon. Coins were also easier to transport rather than transporting all your goods and services under the bartering system. Uniform coins also meant that merchants did not have to use scales to measure metal, which is a very time-consuming process. At a glance, they could determine literally how much money was on the table. This type of currency exchange had large impacts all around the world. Countries began adopting the coin form of currency in order to participate in foreign trade. There were, however, disadvantages to the coin system. For instance, coins weight could change over time due to normal wear and tear. Also, there were criminals who would intentionally file down currencies, which was an offense punishable by death. And also, coins could be counterfeited, unlike in the bartering system. Lastly, coins were also very heavy to carry around in large quantities. Also, it was dangerous to carry these large amounts of money. The Chinese invented paper money in the form of notes, or IOUs, around 700 AD. It became too cumbersome to carry around coins of different increments and weights. Eventually, the people of China allowed private institutions to store their gold and silver coins in exchange for certificates that correlated directly to what they personally had stored. These paper notes could then be easily exchanged back into electrum. The advantages to paper was it was very easy to transport due to it being light. Foreign trade became even easier now that you could give specific denominations of what you wanted to exchange. When Marco Polo visited China, he brought the idea of paper money back to Europe with him, where at the time the Italian florin, which was a type of coin, was universally accepted. Unfortunately, these papers could also be easily counterfeited. While these notes were supposed to be a representation of the money being stored, these institutions frequently issued more notes than they had gold and silver, which ultimately hurt the public's confidence in these institutions. These private institutions also gave rise to the use of banks controlled by governments such as the Federal Reserve, which acted similarly during the gold standard system, which will be talked about shortly. Paper money would not see popularity in the West until about the 1600s, when the bank institutions were created to store gold. Right before World War I, many countries began printing more paper money than they had gold. As a result, this caused a devaluing of their money. At one point, it got so bad in Germany that at one point people were burning wheelbarrows of paper money during the winter in order to stay warm. After World War I, many of the countries came back together to pick up the pieces of their currencies. They all agreed that the gold standard, where their currencies would all be backed by gold. For example, $1 would equal 1/2 ounce of gold. That's just an example. Again, this advantage was desirable because now it meant that people no longer had to carry their gold around with them. However, the problem was, if there was a net transfer of currency from one country to another, then the gold would also have to follow. You can already imagine that that was not the case, and that did not happen. Also, all countries had to be on the same page and agree not to print money just because. As in the case of all of the other monetary systems, eventually countries began to abandon the gold standard during the Second World War, as they began to print a lot of money to fund their military projects. As they printed more money, the value of the gold to dollar ratio went down even more. After World War II, countries came together to determine a monetary trading system that would work. They wanted something that would allow them to trade and keep currency exchange rates fixed. Also, they wanted to keep all countries in this agreement from printing more money when they needed it. They all agreed that the gold standard was too rigid and they needed something that would allow them to keep a leash on the overprinting of money while still allowing flexibility. In 1944, 44 countries came together in the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to come up with a monetary system that would be advantageous to all countries that decided to participate in foreign trade. Because the U.S. held 2/3 of all the world's gold at that time, the U.S. dollar was then chosen to become the world reserve currency, which meant that each other country would then peg their money to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar would then be pegged to gold. Now, that we're not on that same system anymore. However, the U.S. dollar is still utilized as the world's reserve currency. As a result, in the actual Forex market, you will notice that the US dollar has the highest amount of volume when it comes to trades because all countries tend to deal, well, not all countries, most countries tend to deal with the US dollar when it comes to trading. And now you know why. Out of this meeting came two types of institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF's job was to lend money to countries who needed help in order to keep them from printing more money, which would cause the other countries' money to become more devalued. The World Bank's job was to lend money to the new developing countries that wanted to expand and build up their infrastructure. This was also an effort to keep them from just creating money. The Bretton Woods system severely constrained the U.S. economy as they were constantly lending out more U.S. dollars while their gold reserves were continuing to dwindle due to most countries requesting gold in exchange for their currency. In 1971, Richard Nixon announced that they would no longer honor the gold exchange and announced that he would be taking the US dollar off of the gold standard. What a big shock to the world. Nowadays, many countries' currencies are not backed by anything of value anymore. Instead, currencies' values are now determined by the floating exchange rate. Floating exchange rate regimes are not influenced by the government, but instead through the forces of supply and demand in the foreign exchange market, also called the Forex market or FX. Because a currency's value in a floating exchange rate regime are determined by supply and demand, their value can change and change freely and are determined by the foreign exchange market. Some countries included in this managed floating exchange regime include the US, Canada, the Eurozone, and England. On the other hand, China does not participate in the floating exchange rate regime. Instead, their currency is pegged to a basket of currencies. By now, you should have a good understanding of the following questions. Read them quietly to yourself, answer them, and when you are finished, go on to the next video in Forex Foundation 1 series. My name is Adeze Duncan, and remember, I am a student, always.